This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Hello everyone, this is Felienne for SE Radio and I'm here today with Evgeny Shadchnev. Evgeny is a founder and CEO of Makers Academy, a coding school in London in the UK. Since starting in 2013, they've trained over 1,000 developers. And before starting Maker Academy, Evgeny worked as a software developer. Evgeny, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks so much for having me here.
Thanks for being on the show. So today's episode is about code schools. And I want to know, what is a code school?
Code school is a new way of training complete beginners to be an employable software developers. It's an alternative way into the industry. Whereas before, until a few years ago, many people either went to universities or taught themselves to code. Whereas today they can go into an immersive code school and start a coding job in just a few months.
So you already said that the audience of code schools is beginning developers, but can we be a little bit more precise there? Are these people just out of high school? Are they coming from another university study?
Usually they are career switchers. So they've worked for a few years in a different industry, and for different reasons decided to switch careers and become software developers. On our course at Makers Academy, the average age of our students is just under 30 years old. So they're already professionals in their careers, but they would like to add a coding skill to their skill set.
That's interesting, the way you say that. Adding code as a skill to their skill set. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that they're not going to be full-time developers, but rather that they're going to use programming within the job that they are having right now?
Actually, in most cases, they do become full-time developers. But what our hiring partners specifically like about us is that when they hire junior developers from Makers Academy, they are hiring people who are junior as a software developers, but who are not junior as employees. So they get people with real-world experience who can also code. It's quite a different profile from a fresh university graduate who is 21 or 22.
Yeah, that seems like added value.
Yep.
Are there different types of programming jobs that code schools teach for, aim at? Is this like only programming, or can it also be database administrator or sysadmin or front end or back end? Is it generic or specific?
It's a bit of both, really. Generally, coding schools, both in the UK and in Europe and in the US, they try to run generic courses to give the foundation of the most important things required in a software engineering job, but at the same time, inevitably, coding schools run targeted courses for software developers or data science students. But it rarely becomes very, very specific, like database administration, for example. Because before a person is going to specialize in this, they will probably need a broader foundation.
Yeah, so it's really like an introductory programming course or maybe a bachelor's degree that's quite generic, and afterwards you would specialize.
Yep.
Talking about bachelor's degrees, I teach at a university, as some listeners might know, and of course I wonder personally, why do we need code schools? Students can just come to university, even if they're further in life. They could still take university education. How is a code school different? What gap does it fill?
I'm going to speak from experience because personally I learned to code at university. I've got both undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in computer science. The key difference is that first, coding schools tend to get people employable much faster than universities. In other words, we're talking about months and not years. But secondly, coding schools are usually laser focused on getting their developers employed, whereas universities give a much broader foundation, which may be really, really useful for some jobs, but not for all of them. So, for example, when I started working as a junior developer myself after graduating with a master's degree in advanced computing, I realized that many things which I was expected to know as a software developer were not taught at university at all. So I had to learn on the job quite a lot. And that became an inspiration for starting Makers Academy. What if we design a short intensive course that is going to be laser focused on getting people employed first and foremost?
Yeah, so it is small. It's smaller in scope than university education because it's really focused on employment. And in a university, we typically also teach research skills and things that might be useful if you go into an academic career.
Exactly. If you would like to do research in computer science, there is really no other way but getting undergraduate and postgraduate degrees at a good university. But if you would like to start building real software products and join great technology companies, a university can be an option, but it's not the only option.
And you already said in your answer that another difference between universities and code schools is it's years versus months. Mm-hmm. Can you explain a little bit more about the practical side of code schools? Are they full-time or part-time?
They are usually full-time, because in order to get someone to an employable level from scratch, you need to go through approximately 1,000 hours of practice. 1,000 hours is going to be 3 or 4 months of full-time education and maybe at least a year or more of part-time education. So most coding schools offer full-time immersive programs that are trying to get someone from having no experience of coding all the way to being employable in just a few months. At the same time, many coding schools also offer part-time programs, but in order to become employable through part-time education, the students should probably be prepared to invest between 1 and 2 years of their life.
Yeah, because if you do it full-time, then where would you get money? Do you need savings for this, or are there programs where you could get paid to follow the code school? How does it work financially?
Financially, there are different models. Some companies like Makers Academy charge student a tuition fee to study here. Some companies operate as non-profits. They don't charge the students, and they try to raise the funds from the industry. Some companies offer loans to code school students, and this may work quite well. Sometimes future employers sponsor the students to take the course. So really, I think I've seen all possible combinations in the industry. But for the majority of students, I think the majority of students are paying themselves out of their own savings.
Okay, so that's quite an investment.
It's quite an investment.
Do the code schools typically promise job security? Do you work together with companies that need developers to guarantee people they get a job after this?
We work very closely with a large number of employers, but it's very difficult to guarantee a job for a couple of reasons. One of them is legal. If I understand the UK law correctly, it's literally illegal to promise employment after the training unless you sign the contract upfront. But more importantly, it's difficult because not everything depends on the code school. In order to get to a successful result for the student, it needs to be a significant effort on the student side and a significant effort on the coding school side. And because we can only be responsible for us, it's difficult for us to guarantee the employment before we see what happens over the next few months. So what we do instead is we talk about our employment statistics, about our case studies, about what happened to the previous students who went to study with us.
Okay, so it's sort of a risk then that people take.
Yes.
Even though we know that employment is good and it's probably not that hard to take a job. Do you have any generic statistics or maybe statistics from your own code school about how many people get a job and what type of jobs also these are?
The vast majority of people who want to get the job and who are looking for a job, that is regularly going to the interviews, doing code tests, and so on. get it within the first 2 or 3 months after graduation. Sometimes it can be a few days, sometimes it can be a few weeks. The average salary is somewhere between 30 and 35,000 pounds, which is pretty good considering that they've got no commercial experience at all. And then after they start working, it increases every year at a pretty predictable rate.
So you mentioned before that people that go to these code schools are a little bit more mature and they might have other experience.
Mm-hmm.
Does that also mean that they might get into different jobs after the code schools? For example, they start maybe as a senior developer or a project lead instead of starting as a developer because they might have experience in managing. Does that happen?
It does occasionally happen, but it's not the majority of cases. However, we've seen enough situations when somebody with a background of finance, for example, joins a fintech company as a junior developer and then leverages their experience in finance as well as their skills as a developer to build a product. Usually, this is a winning combination for the employer. If they can get a developer who also understands what they are doing as a business, it can be really, really powerful.
Okay, that sounds really good, where you can make a connection between what you learn in the code school and the experience that you already bring from before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
that's what we're trying to do in every case, yes.
So let's zoom into what you actually teach in the code schools. As I said, I'm an educator myself, so I'm really curious. We already covered the difference between a code school and a university, where a code school is more practical, but what does that mean? Can you give a brief overview of the type of courses that you teach?
So we actually teach just one course. So we've got the one course, one curriculum that is designed to help a complete beginner to become an employable software developer. So we focus on the very basics, on the foundation of how to build good software in principle. We use a specific set of technologies, specifically Ruby and JavaScript on the course, but we care more about how they approach software development rather than the very specific technical details of any specific technology. The reason for this is that most of our hiring partners use technologies different from the ones that we are using in our curriculum. We work literally with hundreds of companies, and they use everything from Java to Ruby to Scala to Haskell to pure JavaScript. We've seen pretty much all kinds of requirements, and it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to train our developers to be experts in these specific tech stacks. So instead, we're trying to make sure that they are well-rounded software developers who can pick up a new technology quickly, who understand the basics, and who can hit the ground running fairly quickly.
So you already mentioned the programming language that you use, Ruby and JavaScript. What other technologies do you teach in terms of maybe databases or ORM systems?
So in terms of databases, we usually use Postgres, Mongo, and MySQL, but this is not the important point. We are not trying to push them in the direction of a specific technology. We are helping them to become high-quality junior developers. So by the end of the course, when they get to building their final projects, they are working on a wide range of technologies, and many of them are not even mentioned in the curriculum. So by the end of the course, some of the students may be building websites, some of them will be building mobile applications, some of them will be building virtual reality games, some of them will be doing machine learning projects, somebody will build a simple search engine. And instead of trying to teach them how to do each of these things, we're trying to help them how to learn in the most efficient way and how to build high-quality software. And whether the software is going to be an e-commerce website or a virtual reality project is less important to us.
That's an interesting thing you say there. You say you help them learn. You teach them to learn. How do you teach people to learn? That's a different skill from programming.
That's actually no. It's a very very closely related skill, because programming is a job of a programmer is ultimately about learning. Because software can be easily reused. Every time you build a new software product, you are really learning how to do something new, something that you haven't done before. If it was done before, it can be reused. So the job of a software developer, to a very large extent, consists of learning how to do new things. Technologies change all the time. The new languages, new frameworks are introduced. It really changes significantly. So one of the most important skills we can give to our developers is how to learn efficiently, how to get around the roadblocks, how to work as a team, how to identify the most efficient the learning styles, how to get through emotional roadblocks. We focus on these. We're focusing on these things just because, in our experience, they are so much more important than specific details, more specific technologies.
And that's interesting. This leads to another question that I had is who are your teachers? Because if you teach people about collaboration and about learning, probably programmers are not equipped to teach all those things. Who teaches at code schools?
Actually, this is, you're hinting at one of the biggest challenges for every single code school I know. In order to teach software development, the faculty staff need to be experienced software developers themselves. It's one of the ways in which we are different from universities. Everyone on our coaching team has recent and relevant software development experience. It's really, really important. But at the same time, and this is really difficult, at the same time, they also need to have skills, teaching skills, essentially. They need to know how to help others to learn efficiently. And people like this are incredibly rare and incredibly difficult to find.
But not incredible enough, apparently, because there are code schools and they're running well, so people do manage to find these.
People do manage to find them, but it's one of the biggest challenges for every code school I know. Nobody has ever said that it's easy to find people to run a code school.
And do the teachers typically work full-time for the code school, or is this something they do for a few months and then they go back to a programming job? Because you said something interesting. They all have recent programming skills, so you can only use them, quote unquote, use for a little bit, because in 5 years their experience might be irrelevant. Maybe in 5 months their experience will be irrelevant.
It's actually something in between. I would say that maybe between 2 and 3 years is the sweet spot. It's and it's one of the challenges for most coding schools. If someone has been out of the profession or out of the full-time coding for more than 2 or 3 years, the question is, are they still qualified to teach others how to be good software developers? So, as far as I can tell, most people who help others to learn do it full time, do an amazing job, but in most cases, after 2 or 3 years, start to consider other options, and this is perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, so they sort of naturally, after a while, start doing something else. So there's a natural turnover in the people that teach.
Yes, and at Makers Academy, for example, our internal engineering team is composed almost exclusively out of ex-coaches. After they've been teaching for a couple of years, and then they moved on to do engineering full time again.
Oh, that's nice. It's a nice variety of work, I guess. A nice rhythm of teaching a little bit and then learning and then giving back again. So I'm wondering also about, do you teach a little bit of theory? Because of course you're not going to deliver full-time academics, but more and more of programming is also reliant on some theory. If you want to do functional programming, it's probably handy practically if you know a little bit of lambda calculus, and reactive systems are not that easy conceptually. Do you cover this at all, or is that just too little time for that?
We do, but not in a. We do, but it's some of it is compulsory and expected, and some of it is not. So, for example, you mentioned functional programming. One of the coaches in our team is an expert in has has some really good experience with functional programming. At times, she does deliver very specific workshops focused on functional programming to the students, if it's relevant to them and if it's appropriate for their development. But at the same time, it's not something that we would force all students to learn at every single class. So in other words, there is considerable flexibility in how our curriculum is applied. Sometimes we introduce the elements of functional programming. Sometimes we add some elements of hardware development. Sometimes virtual reality and so on. So there is quite a bit of flexibility.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. The day-to-day of a code school. How does that work? Imagine a full-time program. Students come in for a few months. What do they have? Do they have lectures? How big are the classrooms? Do they do project work? Tell me more about the experience.
Okay, so the experience is about 90% of the time they spend at the code school, or at least at Makers Academy, consists of actually writing software. So we don't give them lectures as such. We give them challenges to overcome and tasks to complete, and when they hit roadblocks or start asking interesting questions, we organize workshops to answer them and then push them towards the next challenge. So in other words, we're trying to simulate a real work environment as much as possible. We are constantly pushing them to be one step ahead of what they are comfortable with at this given moment. And this is why our curriculum is flexible. Sometimes it's possible to go faster, sometimes it's necessary to go a little bit slower, and sometimes a class can go a little bit sideways.
So you mentioned that the students get challenges and tasks. Can you give a concrete example of a challenge? Is that very big, like build a web app, or is it really small, like try binary search?
It depends on the stage of in the course. In the first week, it can be something as simple as build two classes that interact in a specific way and make sure there is test coverage for both of them. So that's something fairly simple and isolated. At a more advanced stage of the course, it can be something more difficult. For example, let's build a website which has a user account management functionality. Basically, you can log in, log out, change your password, recover it by email, and so on. By doing this, the students will inevitably need to learn about how to handle the passwords, how to store them, what's the difference between encryption and hashing, for example, and so on. So they need to understand and research these topics in order to get to a successful implementation. But our job is to keep pushing them in the right direction, keep asking the right questions, and keep giving helpful instructions.
Interesting. And those challenges, the way you build them up, like you start with a small exercise and then it gets bigger, is this something you share? Is this something that you can do on GitHub or you can find? Or is that course material part of your unique proposition and you want to keep that IP close?
Right now, our course materials are closed and we are not publishing them. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that it's the mostly closely guarded secret. It's probably if you email me after the show and ask me to give you access to our curriculum, I'll be happy to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally interested, of course, but I'm also interested in understanding where the unique value of a code school is. Do you think that's in the challenges and the course materials? It's probably more about the environment and the coaches and the fact that they're all working on stuff together.
Yes. So the value proposition is not the curriculum. The curriculum is relatively. The curriculum is the easy bit. What makes coding school special is the environment. Learning full-time in an immersive environment in teams of other people on the same journey with the same goal is an incredible experience. if when it's done in the when this learning is facilitated by skilled coaches and software engineers who can make sure that the learning process is as efficient as possible, it becomes even more useful. And finally, the last value proposition is the support of our careers team. Once our developers graduate from Makers Academy, we work really, really hard to help them sign their first contract. In other words, our work doesn't stop until they get employed.
Nice. Even though, as you mentioned before, there's not a promise, you definitely help them landed their first job.
There is no promise, but our business model relies on the revenues from both students and our hiring partners. So when they do get employed, in most cases we are paid a placement fee for this, and it's a significant part of our revenue. So as a business, we are very strongly incentivized to keep our developers employable.
Yeah, and also I guess that means that the tuition can be relatively low because you have another source of income as well from the people that hire your students.
True. Although our tuition fees are still not nearly as low as we would like them to be.
Yeah, I understand. So what must I imagine for the group size? So I'm thinking of a class. Is that one team, or is that 100 people or 1,000 people? How does that work?
We run classes of up to 24 people. So in our experience, it's the optimal size, which is neither too small nor too big. So right now on our campus there are 3 parallel classes of up to 24 people each.
24 is a pretty big number, so that's bigger than just one team. If they build software collaboratively with all of them, where they play the roles of different teams in one company?
Nope. I don't think they ever work in teams larger than 5 or 6 people, and usually it's probably 4 or 5.
Yeah, sure, but you could still have, like you have in a company, multiple teams that still interact. But you only have projects that are just for smaller groups.
Yes. I don't think we ever tried to build a project that would involve coordinating over 20 people. It would be possible, but it also would be pretty challenging as well.
Yeah, it might be chaotic. And how with 24 people, there are going to be differences in skill quite soon and significantly. How do you deal with that if there are students that pick it up quick enough for them to know a lot, or if there are students that can't really follow, they don't reach the level to participate in the exercise? How do you deal with that?
It all starts with selecting the students really, really carefully. We screen our applicants to the best of our ability because it's really, really important. Any good coding school starts with a good selection of applicants. So we're trying to make sure that when they start, they are already at a similar level in terms of abilities. Of course, we do see different rates of progress on the course, but usually it doesn't cause too many problems. Very occasionally, if a student is struggling too much, we may ask them to leave the course. But it's more of an exception rather than a rule. We're trying to do our best to attract the right candidates on the course and do the selection, do the screening before they start.
Can you talk about the screening a little bit more? Because we're talking about beginning programmers. This is not going to be whiteboards to a hash table live here because they don't know programming. How do you know if they can learn programming?
I think having interviewed several thousand students over the years, we developed a pretty good understanding of what kind of candidates are most likely to become successful software developers. So we are looking at their ability to learn. We are looking at their mental models of themselves and their learning. You must be familiar with the open mindset and fixed mindset models.
Yeah, well, I am, but maybe not all our listeners are. So could you Give a little bit of background here.
In short, in a sentence, if a person believes that they can learn new things, they can change. If they encounter an obstacle, they can get around it, and everything is ultimately within their control, and they can change what they do and how they react to it, and so on. They are likely to be more successful than people who fundamentally believe that what they are able to do is fixed, limited, and determined by outside forces that they don't control. So I'm grossly oversimplifying it, of course, but in short, people who believe in themselves, people who are resourceful about learning and achieving their goals, are just more likely to be successful. So when we interview students, we ask them what they've been doing to learn coding up until now. They are trying to get out of Makers Academy. Why they applied to Makers Academy as opposed to many other options. What are the key challenges they think they are going to encounter when learning how to code? We go through a number of practical exercises, trying to push them to the limit of their knowledge and see how they deal with uncertainty. So, in other words, we're looking not for specific knowledge, because really it doesn't matter. We're looking for their behavior and their attitude and their set of assumptions about themselves and their world as an indication that they are going to be successful on the course. It's not bulletproof, but having seen a few thousand students, I have a lot of confidence in our screening model.
It's of course really different from the way most tech companies interview now, where they really focus on programming capabilities and not so much, I think, on these type of things. Or do you know of other companies? Do they also use these type of interview questions?
Some of them do. I think more and more companies realize that asking questions about specific topics doesn't always work well. Or rather, it works well if you need a very specific area of, or if you need a very specific skill set. If you need an expert in a specific technology for a specific problem, yes, of course you are going to ask questions about that technology. But with junior developers, the situation is different. You don't want them to know the specifics of the latest framework. You want them to be able to learn, to collaborate, to communicate, to not to be afraid of the unknown, to be resourceful, to be proactive, to be inventive, every single day in the workplace. In other words, when you're hiring junior developers, you should be more interested in behavior and attitude rather than the specific details of their technical skills. And more companies are realizing this, yes.
So one more question about selection. Do you do anything to ensure diversity in the candidates you get? Because one of the things you said is in the selection, we want people that are resourceful, but also people that have confidence. And of course, we might not observe these type of character traits neutrally. There's quite some research that if women, for example, seem very confident, then they might be seen as too strong, whereas if men show confidence, then this is an added value. Is there anything you do to ensure diversity?
We do, and we do quite a lot, except one thing. One thing that we've never done with diversity is we never had any kinds of quotas. So we worked pretty hard over the years to make sure that our course has an equal representation of male and female students, for example. But we never screen students based on these attributes. So what we've done instead is we've tweaked our marketing materials to send the message that coding is for everyone and not just for young white male stereotypical developers. From our first year, we offered a discount for female applicants, but just to encourage more female students to apply. We're supporting various minority groups and meetups who are helping the women in tech or Black and Asian students to learn to code. So we are trying to do a lot of work indirectly to make sure that as many people as possible across all kinds of backgrounds realize that coding could be for them it's a viable career, whether you are 20, 30, or 40, whether you've got a university education or not. Basically, regardless of what your background is, you can learn to code, and if it sounds appealing, then maybe you should try.
Cool. And have these things worked for you? Do you attain 50-50% gender?
It took us quite a lot of work, but in November last year was the first time when we achieved a 50-50 split between male and female students in our at Makers Academy. It took a while. Yes, for the first few years, most of the applicants were male, and therefore most of the students were male. And it took quite a lot of work to change that trend and to learn how to attract more diverse candidates.
Cool. So I want to talk a little bit more about the impact that code schools have on the world around us. What do you think the biggest impact is that code schools have?
I think the biggest thing is coding school help a lot of people to learn to code, and I mean those people who wouldn't have become developers otherwise. There is a great demand for software developers, and there is a very large number of people who could become software developers. But realistically, very few people are going to take 3 or 4 years out of their career when they are 25 or 30 in order to go back to university. And coding schools fill this gap by helping a very diverse group of people to learn software development. Coding schools often attract more diverse group of students. There are some coding schools in the States, for example. I'm thinking of Hackbright Academy that only work with women, which helps make the entire industry more diverse. There are coding schools like Founders and Coders in London, UK, for example, who provide free tuition. And this helps to make the industry more diverse because people who wouldn't be able to afford to pay for the tuition learn to code. So it's in short, it does make the industry quite more diverse, and I'm really, really happy to see it happening.
That sounds really good. I think universities could learn a little bit from how you get those diverse candidates. But I'm still curious, why are code schools popular now? Because there's been a demand for programmers for 5 years, 10 years, maybe 40 years. Why do we see those code schools happening now rather than a decade ago?
It's a good question. So I think it probably was possible a decade ago. It's just that not many people tried. 5 years ago, five years ago, Dev Bootcamp, a coding school in the US, launched their program, and that was the event which kickstarted the industry. Many people realized that first you can learn to code in just a few months and get a job. It was probably possible before, but if you asked most people in 2007, I imagine most people would have said that, hey, it's just impossible to learn to code in just a few months. You need to go to university, you need to go to get a university degree, and not many people challenged that assumption back then.
Can you contribute this to one person or one code school? Were there people that really advocated this, or is it more just a movement?
I think the very first people were definitely Dev Bootcamp in the States. They started in 2012, and they've done a really, really good job over the last few years. Essentially, Dev Bootcamp was a trailblazer in this space, and they gave rise to this industry, which is still very young, but it didn't exist 5 years ago.
How is Dev Bootcamp doing now? Are they still around?
Unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, they announced they would close in December. So much to my regret, because they are really one of the best players out there, much to my regret, they said that they weren't able to find a sustainable business model, and therefore they are going to close operation by Christmas. It's a real shame.
Do you understand that? Do you see that lots of code schools are searching for the right business model?
It's yes. Unfortunately, Dev Bootcamp is not the only company that came to this conclusion. There are others. The Iron, for example, who also announced that they would stop operating. And another high-profile company, Galvanize, just announced that they will downsize and let go of approximately 11% of their workforce. So the industry as a whole is actually struggling to find a sustainable business model in this space. It may seem like it's a great business to charge students $8,000, $10,000 or $12,000 to learn to code. But unfortunately, when you look at the economics of coding schools, most of them find it really difficult to stay successful.
Do we understand why? Because it doesn't seem too expensive. You need a location, you need coaches.
It doesn't seem too expensive, but the supply of people who are able to afford a coding school is actually not huge. As this market is there, but it's not limitless, and there is only so much you can charge to a private individual. So really, we're talking about maybe something around $10,000 or pounds. Most coding schools also don't have access to student loans, either in the UK or in the US, meaning that most people are paying out of their own pocket or out of their savings, which is a different situation from, let's say, most undergraduate students. Another problem, systemic problem in the industry is that it has a very low barrier for entry, meaning that when Dev Bootcamp started operating in 2012, dozens of other companies started operating just a year or two later. So now there are probably close to 100 of coding schools in the US alone, and even in London. When we started in 2013, I think we were the first one in February 2013. Today there is half a dozen, and all of us are competing for the same market of people who would like to switch their careers. Unfortunately, from a business perspective, it can be a difficult case, as Dev Bootcamp unfortunately found out.
Yeah. So is there any way out of this, do you see? Do you think that at one point maybe companies will start to fund code schools because they were in need of developers and they could buy a few seats that you could then fill with people for free? Where is this going?
That's pretty much where the industry is going. More and more coding schools, ourselves included. We are working on finding ways to shift our revenue to the corporate side, because you're absolutely right. The answer is, in one form or another, is to charge employers for the training.
And is this working? Do you think that will be the sustainable business model that all the code schools are looking for?
At least some of them. It's this model is successful to various degrees. So let's put it this way: some coding schools are more successful than others in making it work. But it's still very early days, and it's still too early to say what exactly is going to be the winning combination. I've seen quite a few different ways in which coding schools or training providers in general are trying to structure their business models, and it's just too early to call the winner yet.
So what are some of the other ways that funding is structured?
It's possible to charge the employer for training their existing staff, or for training them for a specific project or a set of technologies. It's possible to, some coding schools are partnering with corporates to sponsor people on the course. Sometimes it's done for specific students, sometimes it's done as a general scholarship for open to all applicants. Sometimes coding schools are trying to raise funds from the industry, not to train any specific individual, but to invest into the education of the next generation of developers. So really, I think I've seen all kinds of combinations, all kinds of different variations of business models that the coding schools are trying to implement.
Okay, interesting. And then you said a few times before that you don't really know where it's going. We still have to see what a good model is. There's one more thing I want to reflect on a little bit, and that's the difference between online and offline education. Because, of course, one of the other competitors of code schools are online programs. You have edx.org, Coursera, where there are lots and lots of programming courses as well. Is this something you see as a threat, or is it more something you see as an opportunity because you can use those free coursewares in your education as well?
It's definitely an opportunity. We are very, very happy using existing online materials and online courses to help our students to prepare for the studying at Makers Academy. So when people apply to Makers Academy, I think one of the very first links we will send them is a link to Codecademy, for example. It's also interesting that there are different kinds of online training options out there. There are courses like edX or Coursera, for example, and there are immersive full-time courses delivered online, which are very similar to offline coding schools, but done completely online. That can work really well as well.
So do you think the future of education is this combination of online and offline?
I think it's too early to tell. We've been experimenting with our own online courses over the last 2.5 years. And we learned that some aspects of online education can be really successful and really promising, and in other respects it can be much more challenging. So, for example, when we were running our own online course, also full-time, immersive, 12 weeks and so on, we learned that the quality of the training, the quality of developers is exactly the same as our offline course. But the challenge that we've seen is that it's much more difficult to help our remote students to find employment afterwards, because unlike offline students, they tend to be outside London. In other words, if we get one developer in Paris, one in Berlin, one in Madrid, one in Amsterdam, and one in Glasgow, it's much more difficult for us to help them find great jobs locally. Whereas in London, because our network of hiring partners is so concentrated around London, it's much more doable.
And so you named that, you said there are pros and cons, and one clear downside is that you can't really use your local network for employment. But what would be one of the upsides you see of a combination of online and offline?
If you're doing it purely online, it's going to be significantly cheaper. It's for studying in London is much more expensive. So right now we are charging £8,000 for our on-site course in London. And when we were running our remote course, we priced it at £4,000, basically half price. And if you factor the living cost into account, it becomes even cheaper. So one significant advantage of remote courses is that they can be a real money saver.
Are you still running the online program, or are you doing just offline?
Unfortunately, we decided to close our online program earlier this year. So our last online class is going to graduate next month, and that will be the last one for now.
And this is because of the employment perspective. That's the issue there.
It's one of the main reasons, yes. our entire company revolves around getting our students into jobs, and helping our students get employed at great technology companies is so much easier when students and companies are physically located in the same market. There was something else that we learned as well. Students or applicants tend to prefer the offline experience because they perceive it as superior, even if the employment statistics are similar. Basically, even if they are going to learn exactly the same thing, they would rather be on campus, talking face to face to the coaches and other students, instead of sitting in their bedroom for 3 months, staring at the screen for 12 hours a day.
Yeah, so even though it's more expensive, the experience of the immersion and the group work in the same place, we all understand that is something that definitely adds value.
Absolutely. So it's something that we found over the last 2.5 years when we've been trying to run an online course.
It's so sad because it seems like such a nice solution to a problem where you could do it cheaper, but I totally understand that it's not the same as doing it with a...
Yes, it's not the same. And speaking of making it cheaper, we're trying to figure a way how to make it cheaper using doing it on-site in London. I don't have an answer to this yet, but it's one of the problems we're trying to solve, yes.
Okay, you should definitely keep us posted, of course, on all the great challenges. And we're coming to the end of this episode anyway. So where can we read more about you and about your specific code school?
The first thing is please check out our website. It's makersacademy.com. And you can also find us on our Twitter @makersacademy. There is a blog, blog.makersacademy.com, and you will also find us on YouTube. We've got hundreds of videos showing all aspects of our course. So if you'd like to see what it looks like in real life, please search Makers Academy on YouTube.
Yeah, we will make sure that there's a link to your YouTube in the show notes. Is there anything else you want to add where we can follow you, or something I forgot to ask about?
Probably just one last thing. If you've been listening to this conversation for the last hour and you're still skeptical that it's possible to get to an employable level in just a few months, please go to our website and check out some of our case studies. I've seen complete beginners to go from no knowledge of web development to great careers at companies like BBC, Financial Times, Sky News Corporation, The Economist, and hundreds of others. And I'm really, really proud of the work we do.
Cool. We'll make sure that we add a link to those cases also in the show notes.
Thank you.
So people that are still skeptical should totally check them out and see.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for being on the show. It was really interesting, and we will make sure to put everything in the notes.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.